Huh?
You need some more chairs.
I know. Can we?
I can stand. How about I stand?
Should I go grab more chairs? Huh?
I can go grab more chairs.
Okay.
Yeah.
How you doing, Detroit?
Yes, but you don't have to.
Right. The forward is some mistake. Oh, right, you mentioned that. That's right. We did. We were at Vegas. I know, it doesn't
Somebody
take very
can-
long to cover them all, right? Professor Clarkson displaced.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks, those of you sitting back there. We're getting a few more chairs. We'll bring them in. But I'll do a few of our normal housekeeping announcements first. First of all, thank you so much for a great semester. This is our final event, and you guys made it a lot of fun. Thanks for coming. We've had a great lineup this semester, and we're going to hopefully keep it going in the fall. So stay tuned for those updates. We're confirming our speakers shortly. We're getting our list together and sending out those invites. Also, we do want to hear from you. If you have ideas of speakers that you want to have come here and speak at a practice event, reach out to any of the officers. We're happy to take those suggestions. I was asked to mention this again. If you're not on our Snapchat yet, follow our Snapchat, Hillsdale Praxis, because that's what you kids are into now, I guess. And I think that's it. So thanks again for a great semester. So now I'll introduce our final speaker this semester, Dr. James Otteson. Dr. Otteson is the Thomas W. Smith Presidential Chair in Business Ethics, Professor of Economics, and Executive Director of the Eudaimonia Institute at Wake Forest University. He is also a Senior Scholar at the Fund for American Studies in Washington, D.C., a Research Professor in the Freedom Center and Department of Philosophy at the University of Arizona, a visitor of Ralston College, a Research Fellow for the Independent Institute in California, and a member of the Board of Director of Ethics and Economic Education of New England. James Otteson received his bachelor's degree from the University of Notre Dame and his PhD from the University of Chicago. He came to Wake Forest in 2013 and has taught previously at Yeshiva University, New York University, Georgetown University, and the University of Alabama. He specializes in political economy, the history of economic thought, 17th and 18th century liberalism, and our talk tonight, Adam Smith. So without any further delay, Dr. James Otteson.
Very much for that kind introduction, all that, and I'm still a disappointment to my mother-in-law. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming out this evening to hear about Adam Smith. So how many of you have read something from Adam Smith? Yeah, that's the first time of all the talks I've given on Adam Smith that more than one or two people have raised their hands. So congratulations to Hillsdale College, which, by the way, is the home of the great professor Bradley Berzer. How many of you know Bradley Berzer? He's a longtime friend of mine. We actually met as undergraduates and roomed together for a while. I don't know if you knew that about us. So I can tell you all the good Bradley Berzer stories after the talk. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. So my PhD is in philosophy, but I have a position in an economics department and in a business school, which is a very strange thing. But my odyssey, I won't tell you all about all of the odyssey that led me to that place, but it has something to do with Adam Smith. So you may know, you may remember the 2008-2009 economic downturn, the Great Recession. Do you remember that? So after that happened, there was a lot of blame that went around for that. People discussed who or what was to blame. Maybe the financial industry, maybe banking, maybe business in general, maybe capitalism in general. Some of the blame went to business schools. And there were claims that business schools were teaching either things the wrong way or they weren't teaching the right kinds of things, training students in the wrong kinds of moral beliefs. So a lot of business schools decided that they needed to do some self-reflection. Are we teaching things the right way? Are we doing it in the way we ought to be doing it? And after a long period of soul-searching, which probably lasted a good 15 minutes, almost all of them said, yep, we're doing everything exactly the right way. We need to make no changes whatsoever, keep our heads down, and we'll just move forward. Wake Forest, to its credit, I had nothing to do with this, decided to take that a little more seriously, and that's why I'm here. So they recruited me to come to Wake Forest to see if we could figure out some way of understanding perhaps a moral purpose of business, which connects with what I'd like to talk to you about today. So I've written quite a bit about Adam Smith. I wrote my dissertation on Adam Smith. Adam Smith's moral theory. Now, how many of you knew that Adam Smith wrote a different book? I mean, really, it just never happens. All right, well, I'm not going to waste time with that then. All right, so my whole first slide was this. Who is Adam Smith? So I'm just going to tell you what you already knew. So Adam Smith was born in a tiny town called Kirkcaldy, that's how it's pronounced, Kirkcaldy, Scotland. If you know something about the geography of Scotland, it looks a little bit like the state of New Jersey, so it's like an hourglass, sort of. And coming off the North Sea is a little finger of water that comes in. Edinburgh, which is the capital of Scotland, is on the south side of that little finger of water, and directly across from it is this tiny little town called Kirkcaldy. If you go there today, you can see there's a plaque that says, here is where Adam Smith, the author of The Wealth of Nations, was born. The building he was born in doesn't exist anymore. That was torn down in the 19th century, but there's a plaque there. And in the one piece of great poetic universal justice, if you're looking at that plaque and you turn around, there's sort of an open cobblestone walkway, and right on the other side of it is this huge 2-story McDonald's. So it all seems fitting. So he was part of an astonishing period of learning that we now call the Scottish Enlightenment. So during the period roughly from Smith's date, so 1720-ish to 1790-ish, many of the great innovations in human learning were going on, of all places, in Scotland. So if you wanted to be at the cutting edge of everything from medicine to biology to engineering to geology to mathematics to fine arts to economics and political economy, it was all happening in Scotland. Adam Smith was close friends with perhaps the greatest English-speaking philosopher, one of the greatest of all time, named David Hume. Have you heard of David Hume, too? Yeah, all right. So they were actually lifelong friends. They were also lifelong bachelors. And until fairly recently, nobody ever had the question that's now in your mind, which is, were they anything other than friends? So we don't have any reason to think they were anything other than just platonic friends, but they were deep and dear platonic friends. Hume apparently asked at least 2 women, maybe 3 women, to marry him, and they all said no. There's some apocryphal stories about that. One of them apparently because he was too fat. That was the quote. He was a rather large man. There's a second story that Hume actually got himself, his rotund self, down onto one knee to ask a woman to marry him, and she said, "Oh, David, I'm so sorry, but I'm already betrothed to somebody else." And he said, "Well, that's awkward." And he couldn't get up. So he asked if she would help, and she tried. She couldn't get him up, so she had to go get her fiancé to come for David to get up. Now Smith himself, apparently, we only know this because of a student of Smith's who wrote a biography of Smith on Smith's death. That student said that Adam Smith had fallen in love with a woman, and apparently the love was returned, and he was preparing to ask her to marry him when Smith's mother fell ill. And so he was an only child, and his own father had died about a week after he was born, so it was just as he and his mother. And so being a dutiful son, he moved back into with his mother to take care of her in her final days, which lasted 17 years. So he lost his chance. So we don't know who that woman is. The student didn't name her because she was still alive at the time, and he said he didn't want to bring shame to her, so we don't know who that is. In any case, they were very close friends. Okay, so back to Smith. So Smith is often called the father of economics because of his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which many people, they target that as the beginning of what we now recognize as economics. There was no discipline called economics in the 18th century. That didn't become anything until the 19th century, about 100 years later. But I would like to suggest, and this may be more plausible to those of you who've read or know that he wrote more than one book, that he might be more accurately thought of as the father of social science. He was really trying to understand how human beings organize themselves into large-scale social institutions. Where do these come from? How do they change over time? Why do some of them go away and new ones come into existence? And he applied this thinking, almost Newtonian thinking, to various areas of human social life. Morality, so the phenomenon of human moral judgment making, also what we now think of as economics. Okay, so he was a moral philosopher and an economist. His professorship, he was a professor of moral philosophy. Does anybody know how many? Maybe this is something I can stump you on. I mean, your students know everything about Smith. How many professors of moral philosophy were there in Scotland in Smith's lifetime? One. Just one. There was one professorship of moral philosophy, and it was designated by the Crown. And so if you were the professor of moral philosophy, you were the professor of moral philosophy. Hume was up for the job twice and didn't get it, to his great disappointment. So he had multiple disappointments in his life. But Smith did get the job. Okay, so Smith only published 2 books in his entire life, barely enough to get tenure at a modern university. There they are, Theory of Moral Sentiments and what's now called, shortened to The Wealth of Nations. The Theory of Moral Sentiments is on human morality, so those of you who have read it or looked at it, you have some sense of this. It was not a book of moralism. Most works in moral philosophy at the time were spending a lot of time telling people how to behave. To be a moral person, you should believe this and do this. If you do these, believe these things or do these things, you're immoral. That's not so much what that book is about. Smith was almost single-handedly, not quite, but almost single-handedly ushering in a new way of thinking about morality because he wanted to look empirically at what human beings actually do. Where do we get our moral sentiments from? Why do they change over time? Why is there overlap but not perfect coincidence among different cultures, etc.? He wanted to approach it something like an empirical scientist, maybe what we would call cognitive psychology today, something like that. The Wealth of Nations was about, so one of the things I like to say is that the title of that book is not an inquiry into the nature and causes of the poverty of nations. It's the Wealth of Nations. That was very important. What do you have to do to be poor? Literally nothing. If you do nothing, you will be poor. That wasn't what required explanation. What Smith was one of the first to understand was that what required explanation was why some places were able to create wealth and others weren't, and what was the difference. So it was one of the first systematic investigations into what are the causes of wealth. Now, one thing I'd like to suggest, which actually connects to the larger theme I want to talk about tonight, is some scholars have thought there was a problem, and I don't know if you talked about this problem in your class. So Smith only wrote these 2 books. Theory of Moral Sentiments, can you read it? Is it okay? Theory of Moral Sentiments talks about something like our natural human sympathy. Those of you who've read the book remember that term, desire for mutual sympathy of sentiments. Wealth of Nations talks about what we now think of as economics and refers to something called self-interest or self-love. Do you see the problem, or the potential problem? In the 19th century, some German scholars who were reading these 2 books together thought they discovered a problem, and the problem was, well, which is it? Are human beings naturally sympathetic, or are they self-interested? Seemingly you can't be both. And so they wondered, how do these 2 books go together? And the Germans, being Germans, gave it a very grave-sounding name, Das Adam Smith Problem. So what is that problem? That problem is, well, the first book, written when he was young and maybe idealistic and maybe hadn't really seen much of the world, he believed somehow that people cared about one another. That was the sympathy stuff. And then, after writing that book, he grew up a little bit, he did some traveling, he went to France, and everything goes south when you go to France. Came back and realized, oh, no, none of that empathy or sympathy stuff, it's really about self-interest. So the Germans thought that maybe this was signified a fundamental transition in outlook. He used to think one thing about human motivation and human nature, and then he came to believe something else. So as that problem, the so-called problem, came into the 20th century, and to English-speaking scholars who started talking about it, English-speaking scholars being much wittier than the Germans, they gave it this name, the Adam Smith problem. That's as close as we get to a joke in economics, isn't it? But there's been an enormous amount of ink spilled about this, and for full disclosure, I myself have written about it, whether there really is a conflict between the 2 books, and if so, why would there be, or if there isn't, how do they reconcile? But what I'd like to suggest for tonight is that this is not just a question for Smith scholarship, it's not just an exegetical question, it's a question for us. The question really is How do markets and morality go together? Or can they? Can you be a fully moral person and fully participate in a market-based commercial society? That was a question that Smith set for himself, and I think that question endures, and boy, will that be on the front burner for next year's election. So we talk about it now. Is it possible for capitalism, if you like, or a market economy to be consistent with justice? So let's talk about Smith's resolution of that. Yeah, so any representation you ever see of Smith will only be of his right side. Smith never sat for a portrait. He's one of the few luminaries of the Scottish Enlightenment not to do so. He refused to do so because he thought he was too unattractive. And he thought his right side was less ugly than his left side. So the only sides. Is that something you knew already? Poor guy. Okay, so what I'd like to do is to tell you what his conception of justice is, raise a potential objection to it that we might call something like social justice, and see how that might connect or shake out with markets. Okay? So here is his conception of justice. Smith thought that in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, the first book, that virtue towards others, so he did think there was such a thing as prudential virtue, prudence, which is organizing your own behavior in a certain way to achieve your own ends. But when you're dealing with other people, there are two categories of virtue. One is negative, one is positive. The first one is justice, that's the negative virtue. These are his terms, negative. And beneficence is the positive. Now, don't call that benevolence. Not the same thing. So maybe you use those interchangeably. Does anybody use the word beneficence, really? So if there are any Latin scholars, you will know this. So benevolence comes from, they both have the same beginning, bene, which means good. But benevolence comes from the Latin verb volere, which means to wish or will. So benevolence means to wish someone well. So I have benevolence towards all of you. I have benevolence towards all humankind. It's a very easy thing. It just means I hope things turn out well for you. Very different from beneficence. Beneficence, the second word, comes from the Latin verb facere. Be careful how you say that. Facere, which means to make or do. Beneficence is not just wishing people well, but taking positive action to actually improve another person's situation. That's much more difficult. Benevolence is cheap. Beneficence is not cheap. It's costly. Okay? So that's what the difference between justice and beneficence will be. Let me be more specific with justice. So why is justice a negative virtue? So Smith thinks that the virtue towards others either involve what he calls negative or positive. The negative is refraining from hurting other people. So if I don't injure you, if I don't make you worse off, if I leave you exactly as you were, then I'm not making you, I'm not, as he says, visiting, do I have that in there? Hurting our neighbor. I'm not visiting, as he calls it, a real positive harm on you, leaving you exactly as you were. So restraint, or refraining from injury, constitutes what he wants to call justice. And he has this sort of famous quote, which you probably talked about in your class. We may often fulfill all the rules of justice by sitting still and doing nothing. What does that mean? Everybody in this room, I assume, is respecting the rules of justice with respect to one another, because you're not injuring each other. So merely refraining from injuring or making somebody else worse off means you are acting in accordance with justice. That's not all there is to virtue, however. The other part of it is the positive part, which is beneficence. And that's, as I said, taking positive action in the service of another person to improve another person's situation. So is that distinction clear to everybody? So if somebody says to you, hey, would you give me a ride to the airport? And suppose you don't really have you have a car and you don't really have anything to do, you're just playing Fortnite or whatever, and your friend needs a ride to the airport, and you say no. Now let's suppose you should have said yes, but you say no. Is that an infraction of justice or an infraction of beneficence? In lecture pop quiz, which one is it? Beneficence. That would be, if anything, maybe it's nothing, but if it is a moral fault in any way, it would be a failure of beneficence, meaning there's some way you could have helped another person and you chose not to. It wouldn't be a failure of justice because you didn't make that person worse off. It's not like you went out to your friend's car and flattened the tires or something. That would be an injustice. Okay, so what that means is that injustice leaves you worse off, constitutes, for Smith and in jurisprudence, an injury, whereas a lack of beneficence just leaves you as you were. Okay? Is that everybody clear on that distinction? Okay, so that's very important for where we're going to go. Now, what are the Smiths? There you go. Yes. What are Smith's rules of justice? Luckily, there are only 3, so it's not very hard to remember. And I'm going to give you a mnemonic device so you'll remember it forever if you haven't already committed this to memory. So, what are the 3? There are 3 laws of justice. One is to guard the life of our neighbor. The second one is to guard his property and possessions. And the third is to guard his personal rights, in other words, promises and contracts. Okay, so what does that mean? You do not commit an injustice if you do not attack, molest, assault, or enslave another person. That's first. Or if you do not trespass on, steal from, or defraud another person out of their property. That's the second. Or if you make a promise, you have to keep it. Now, how could you, remember that quote about sitting still and doing nothing? You can fulfill all the rules of justice by sitting still and doing nothing. How is that consistent with the third one there? If you make a promise, you have to keep it. That sounds like you have to do something. If you want to be able to fulfill all the rules of justice by sitting still and doing nothing, how would you be able to do that number 3? Easier than you think. Yes, sir?
Don't make promises.
Don't make a promise. Exactly. So if you made no promise to anybody, so who are we describing here? Ebenezer Scrooge? You remember Ebenezer Scrooge? Everybody hates Ebenezer Scrooge, right? You're supposed to hate him. He's a terrible guy. What does Ebenezer Scrooge do? Does he ever attack anybody physically? Nope. Does he ever steal from anybody? Nope. Does he ever violate any of his promises? Nope. So he fulfills, and I think Dickens was trying to give a dramatic, sort of negative portrayal of an Adam Smithian view of justice. So Smith says, you might not like Scrooge, but the one thing you can't accuse him of is injustice. What might you be able to accuse him of? A lack of beneficence. That you could. But you have, and this is going to be Smith's crucial claim, you have no claim to another person's beneficence. You can't demand another person's beneficence. If someone chooses not to be beneficent towards you, it's a bummer, but they don't have to. It's not a violation of justice. That's going to be exactly where the social justice objection will come in. Here's your mnemonic device you remember for every person's property promise, the 3 Ps. So the 3 Ps of justice for Adam Smith. I'm going to quiz you later, or maybe your professors will. All right, now if that's what justice is, what's the main duty of government? Right. Now, maybe not the sole duty of government, but the main duty of government. And it has to do that before it can do anything else. Okay, so now let me raise the question that I'm going to call something like a social justice objection. And it's this. It seems kind of a thin conception of justice. When people talk about justice today, they typically mean something broader than just refraining from injuring another person. They typically want to build some other things into it. And so the question that you might ask is it too thin? And more specifically, does it require positive action? Does justice require sometimes, maybe some particular circumstances which we could try to spell out, but at least in some cases, does it require positive action? In other words, do we have enforceable duties to help others? And now when I say enforceable duties, I mean beyond express promises or contracts. So if you make a promise, yes, then you have to fulfill your promise. If you have a contract, yes, you have to fulfill your contract. But that assumes that these were voluntarily entered into, you knew what you were doing. The question is, are there duties, enforceable duties to help, not based on any kind of express promise or commitment that you made? That's the question. And what I want to suggest is that much, not all, people define social justice in different ways, but much of the discussion of what's called social justice is arguing that, in fact, we do have duties, and maybe even enforceable duties, to help others, even people we've never met before, or totally unknown to us. So there's your picture of Smithian justice. I would have put up Ebenezer Scrooge. I should have said that since I mentioned him. I don't know if you've seen the movie Wall Street. Have you all seen that movie? I'm dating myself with that, but you should watch it. And there's J.D. Rockefeller. Here's a nickel boy. Okay. So here's the question. And I want to raise it in terms of a philosopher named Peter Singer. Have you heard of Peter Singer? Wow, you guys are good. Peter Singer is a philosopher at Princeton University, famous for a lot of different things. But one of the things that he's famous for is this example. I don't know if you've heard of this example, if you're aware of it, but here's the story. You're on your way. Suppose you're graduating from Hillsdale College, and you're an economics major, and what you really want to do is work at Thomson Reuters. And you actually landed the interview. It's your dream job. You go to New York City for your interview, you're wearing your only suit, and you have your only pair of nice shoes, and you're on your way in, and as you're going in, you pass a man-made fountain outside of the building, and what do you notice but there's a little child drowning in it? Okay, so you look around, there isn't anybody to help that child. It's not your child. You didn't throw the child in there. You had nothing to do with it, but you look around, in Singer's example, and you realize that if you don't wade in to save that child is going to drown, will die. So don't ask where the child's parents are. That's not part of the example. So pretend, I don't know, the child came out of who knows where. So there's a child in this pond. So the question Singer asks is, if it's the case that if you go in and save that child, you will also thereby, say, ruin your clothes and miss your interview and not get your dream job, should you still save the child? Even though it's not your child, even though you committed no Smithian injustice against the child, should you save the child? Can we answer that all together? Should you save the child? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yes. If you're in that situation, you should save the child. Okay. So that's not supposed to be the hard part. For Singer, the hard part is if you accept that principle, you should save that child if you can. In that particular case, then you should accept it in other cases too. Specifically in cases of children whom you could save who are starving on the other side of the planet. So if you bought Starbucks, how much did your double pumpkin spice mocha latte cost you? If it's $5, is it possible that that very same $5 could have given a meal to a child which could have saved a child from starvation? If so, is the value to you of that latte greater than the value to that child of not starving? And if your answer, you can imagine what your answer would be, but that's exactly what Singer wants, the conclusion he wants you to come to. So not helping another shouldn't just be a matter of insufficient to be beneficent. Singer thinks that's not strong enough. If somebody could help, especially in a grave situation, but doesn't, that's not just, well, we wish you were more beneficent. It should be something like, you're unjust. You acted unjustly. And that term, justice, is preferred because not only does it have a sense of gravity, it's a very strong term, maybe even suggesting self-evidence, but the other part of it is, if you've acted unjustly, that sounds a lot like you did something we can punish you for. So think about the other kinds of injuries. If you're attacking somebody, we can stop you, we can physically stop you, we can put you in jail. If you acted unjustly when you were supposed to be helping somebody and didn't, then maybe that gives us at least a prima facie initial case for punishing you, even coercively if necessary. So Singer says that letting people die is morally equivalent to killing. Now it's a strong claim, but that is the claim he makes. So if you let someone die that you could have saved, it's the moral equivalent to actively having killed that person, he says, because the end result is the same. The person dies, and you could have prevented it. Okay, so as I mentioned, social justice theory has a lot of different definitions, but one of them, and maybe a main one, is that justice requires positive action to incorporate some of the duties of beneficence into the conception of justice. All right, so what I'd like to do is that's the objection I want to entertain. And I'll just give you a couple of potential defenses of it of Smith. So I'll just look at two, I think. So here's a passage that many of you will know. I apologize about all the words. What's the species of domestic industry? Could you just complete that on your own? Some of you won't have committed this to memory. Which is capital can employ, and of which the produce is likely to be of the greatest value. Who can judge of that? Every individual, it's evident, can judge of this in his local situation much better than any statesman or lawgiver can do for him. I call this the local knowledge argument. And it's something like this. Many of you, are you all economics students? Is everybody an economics student? Anybody who's not? Never had any economics? Oh, all right. So we can think of this a little bit like allocating resources. If you assume that resources are scarce, which they are, then what you want to do is to put the first cut, as it were, of your limited resources to the most important value first, then to the second most important value second, and so on down the line. So the question is, if you have limited resources, you have to make decisions about where they should go, and every choice you make has a trade-off or an opportunity cost. It means you're giving something else up. So how do you know where the best place to put it is? The Smithian local knowledge argument is that typically the person best positioned to know how you should allocate your own limited resources, your time, your talent, your treasure, who is that person most typically? You. Because you possess knowledge.